Are you ever scrolling Kijiji or Craigslist or any kind of used bike classifieds and you see these old vintage bikes and you're really curious as to whether or not it's worth buying it and what vintage actually is with these bikes? I'm going to try and clarify it. So a lot of the time vintage on used bike classifieds means really beat up and probably not worth fixing, and you might not even be able to get parts for it these days. A lot of the time it's true, yeah, they're not really worth fixing, but you can get some of these bikes on a really tight budget in decent working order. And the big benefit to these older bikes compared to more modern ones is even though they're heavy and slow and can be a little tricky to work with sometimes, they're built to last. These frames are almost all made out of really thick steel. The rims are made out of steel, so yes, they can rust, but a little bit of a dent here and there isn't going to make much of a difference. The fenders are made out of steel, so these are going to last forever. And a lot of these older bikes actually have really decent paint jobs. So you can see this old Raleigh, this is from probably the 70s or so. It's still in really good working order. There's barely any rust on it other than the rims. So if you can identify one like this, definitely worth getting as a project. Well, but when I say worth it, depends what you're going to do with it, right? If you were to try and, say, build up a custom fixie, honestly, these days you can get a good fixie from one of the budget-related companies like Villano or something like that for $150, maybe $200. It's not a ton of money to buy that style of bike new. And building up these old vintage bikes into fixies usually isn't worth it because it involves buying a new wheel set. The next thing you might wonder about is collector's value. No, a lot of them don't really. You might be able to find some that do have some collector's value, but a lot of the time, the ones that are truly collectible have already been snapped up by serious cyclists. So a bike like this, despite being in good shape and fairly old, and technically an antique, there's not much collector's value to it. What they are good for is if you want a solid urban bike that fits a tight budget, isn't likely to get stolen, and is still relatively comfortable. So when I was saying that you can have compatibility issues with older bikes, one of the big examples with bikes like this is the tires. These run a 26 by 1 3/8 tire, which actually uses a different standard of 26-inch compared to 26-inch mountain bikes that you see these days. So you can get tires for bikes like this, but it's near impossible to get the wheels. And if your wheels are in rough shape, it might not be worth fixing. You can get a modern 26-inch wheel with a slightly different diameter, but then your brakes wouldn't fit right. So modifying these bikes in any way, not really worth it. So you have to make sure that your wheels and tires are in fairly good shape. One thing about these wheels though is sometimes you'll try and pedal the bike and the pedals will spin freely and it won't engage the back wheel. That is because these have what's called an internal gear hub. Unlike a normal wheel where the gears are exposed and the mechanism can be damaged by water or anything like that, in these, a lot of the time if it's not working, it's just because the grease inside the back wheel is dried up. These run on essentially a planetary gear set like on a car transmission, and they're extremely durable. There's a little port inside the hub where you can actually put oil, and a lot of the time that'll revive older internal gear hubs. This design's been around since I think the 1920s with Sturmey Archer, and Sturmey Archer systems are still in use today. The fenders and rack on this bike are also really nice. A full fender set like this gives you really good coverage, so if you are riding in bad conditions, say you're commuting with the bike and you have to ride in the rain from time to time, these will keep you almost entirely dry. And these come built in on a lot of older bikes like this, so good solid metal fenders in good condition are something that's worth looking for. The bike also comes with a chain cover that does something similar. That's going to keep your pants out of there nicely so you stay properly clean. Now it's time to take a couple laps around the shop so that I can show you what bikes like this are like to ride. Describing the ride quality of a bike is somewhat subjective, so this is just my opinion, but hear me out. The modern equivalent of this bike would likely have much more aluminum in its frame and components, which would make it much stiffer. The ergonomics would also make the pedaling position feel very efficient. This bike's riding position is very upright and comfortable, but it feels sluggish and inefficient to pedal by comparison. The bike is made almost entirely of steel, and it's built in such a way that the steel flexes a lot to absorb vibration and add to the comfort. The side effect of this is that the bike feels noodly and doesn't lend much confidence to the rider when moving at any decent pace. In terms of the braking and shifting, everything works fairly well despite the age of the bike. The brakes are made of very basic steel and plastic, so they don't offer much feedback, but they stop the bike well enough. Something to keep in mind about these bikes is that steel rims and old school rim brakes have next to no power when they're wet.
The shifting is pretty good. The old Sturmey Archer system takes some getting used to, but it reaches all 3 gears fairly easily. The gear range is acceptable for flat areas, but it doesn't go low enough for steeper hills.
So they have their disadvantages, but they're utilitarian, they're fun to ride, and they last a really long time if they're well maintained. Vintage bikes like this old Raleigh, worth looking into.